In the royal town of Ikena, where red dust clung to the hems of long dresses and every rumor traveled faster than the harmattan wind, there lived a young seamstress named Amadi, a quiet woman with clever fingers, patient eyes, and a back that had learned to bend without breaking. She worked from a mud-walled room at the edge of the market, stitching torn wrappers, school uniforms, harvest shirts, and wedding veils for people who praised her skill in private and ignored her in public. Because in Ikena, talent was admired only when it came wrapped in wealth. Amadi had no husband, no father, no brothers to speak loudly for her in the square, and no family name that could silence mockery. Her mother had died under the shadow of a lie years before, accused of stealing ceremonial cloth from the palace storehouse, and though nothing had ever been proven, the stain of that accusation remained on the daughter like smoke trapped in fabric. So Amadi lived carefully. She spoke gently, charged little, delivered early, and thanked people who did not deserve her gratitude. But even the most careful woman cannot hide from cruelty on the day the whole town gathers to celebrate. On the morning of the New Yam Feast, when drums rolled through the streets and women painted their palms with bright camwood, and the rich displayed gold heavier than their kindness, Amadi carried a folded ceremonial robe she had spent 6 nights sewing for the family of Chief Beko's sister. She had embroidered every edge by lamplight, her fingertips raw from thread and beadwork, because the robe was to be worn during the welcome dance before the elders. And although the family had bargained her down to almost nothing, she still made it beautiful. She reached the great compound just as guests were arriving, and before she could step past the gate, a loud voice cut through the morning like a whip. "Look who has come," said Lady Siwa, the chief's sister-in-law, her bracelets clinking as she laughed. "The poor seamstress thinks she belongs among people who celebrate with full plates." Heads turned. A few women covered their mouths. A line of young men waiting near the carved pillars grinned at each other. Amadi lowered her eyes and offered the robe with both hands, hoping the task would pass quickly. But the humiliation had only begun. "Is this not the girl whose mother was named a thief?" another woman said, not softly enough. "Why bring her near the feast cloths? Count your silver after she leaves." A burst of laughter followed. Then, from beside the drummers stepped Kato, the wealthy trader's son, a broad-shouldered man with polished sandals and the kind of smile that enjoyed being feared. A year earlier, he had courted Amadi in secret when her beauty entertained him, but he vanished the moment his mother promised him a richer bride. Now, seeing an audience before him, he chose spectacle over decency. He looked Amadi up and down and said, "A person may know how to sew a robe, but that does not mean she can wear dignity. Some cloth was not made for certain shoulders." The laughter grew louder. Someone clapped. A child repeated the insult without understanding it, and the adults laughed again. Amadi stood there with the robe in her trembling hands, while heat rose behind her eyes. Not because she had never been mocked before, but because there are wounds that hurt more when they are opened in public. She might have dropped the robe and run, but at that same moment, one of the kitchen girls stumbled on a broken stone while carrying a pot of palm soup, and the steaming broth tipped toward a little boy standing nearby. Amadi moved before thought arrived. She thrust the folded robe into Lady Sewa's hands, pulled the child backward, and took the splash across her own arm. The skin reddened instantly. The boy began to cry. The crowd gasped. For one heartbeat there was silence, but instead of thanking her, Lady Sewa hissed, "Clumsy people bring clumsy spirits," as if Amadi herself had caused the accident. Still, Amadi said nothing. She soothed the child, told him he was safe, and stepped away from the compound while the drumming resumed as though kindness had not just been punished in front of everyone. She walked through the market with her burned arm wrapped in the loose end of her faded scarf, past fruit sellers and basket weavers and spice women calling out prices, and she would have gone straight home if she had not noticed an old, blind drummer sitting alone near the well, his calabash overturned and his coins scattered in the dust because boys had mocked him and kicked his walking stick aside. Amadi knelt without hesitation. She gathered the coins, dusted his wrapper, found the stick, bought him bean cakes with the only copper left in her purse, and placed the food in his hand as though she was serving a chief. "May your road be softer than today," the old man said. She smiled and answered, "And may your song outlive the laughter of fools." Unseen by Amadi, a traveler seated beneath the neem tree across the square had watched everything from the first insult at the feast gate to the last act of mercy by the well. He wore no royal cloth, only a plain indigo tunic and leather sandals powdered with road dust, but there was a steadiness in the way he observed the town, as if he were weighing more than what eyes could show. His name, at least the name he gave that day, was Jabari. By sunset a storm had gathered over Ikena, sudden and restless, with winds that slapped shutters and bent the plantain leaves low. Amadi lit her lantern and settled before her sewing table, intending to repair school shirts through the night, when a knock sounded against her door. Outside stood the same traveler from the market, rain beginning to stripe his shoulders. He bowed politely and said, "Sister, forgive the hour. The inn is full because of the feast, and the road to the next town is flooding. I was told the seamstress at the edge of the market is kind even when others are not. May I rest here until the storm weakens? I can pay for a corner of the floor." Most people in Amadi's position would have refused a stranger after dark. Yet there was nothing reckless in his eyes, only fatigue and quiet discipline. So she stepped aside and said, "I have little room and less food, but what is here may be shared." She served him millet porridge and roasted groundnuts, apologizing for the simplicity of the meal. He thanked her as if she had placed a royal banquet before him. When he noticed the burn on her arm, he asked what had happened. Amadi could have used the chance to pour out her bitterness, but she only said, "A child was near danger, and my arm was nearer." Jabari studied her face for a moment and replied, "Some people spend their whole lives protecting their pride. Very few protect others first." Rain hammered the roof. The lantern flame leaned and steadied. Outside, the town celebrated under canopies and within stone compounds, while inside that narrow room, a poor seamstress and a dusty traveler spoke like equals. He asked about her work, and she told him how she learned to sew from her mother, who believed a straight seam could reveal the discipline of a heart. He asked why she lived alone, and at first she said only that death and rumor are both expensive things for a family to survive. But as the night deepened, the story unfolded. Years ago, just before the Festival of Rivers, her mother, Neria, had been commissioned to repair an old ceremonial cloth from the palace storehouse, a cloth said to have belonged to the first queen who united the region's clans. The cloth disappeared before it could be returned. The palace steward blamed Neria. Wealthy voices repeated the accusation until it became truth in the minds of people who had seen nothing. Neria fell ill beneath the shame and died before the rains returned. Amadi was left with a single sewing box, a broken stool, and a name that people spoke with suspicion. "Did you never search for proof?" Jabari asked. Amadi looked at her hands. "Proof is easiest to find for those who already have witnesses willing to see," she said. "The poor do not lack innocence. They lack listeners." Jabari said nothing for a while. Then he asked whether she had kept any of her mother's things. Amadi pointed to an old wooden trunk beneath her bed. Inside were a few wrappers, a measuring cord, rusted shears, and a bundle of unfinished embroidery wrapped in linen. Jabari did not touch anything without permission, but when she unfolded the bundle, both of them saw stitched into the hidden underside of the linen a small crest made from blue thread and cowrie white beads. The royal mark of the river house, a mark no ordinary tailor would dare imitate. Tucked into the seam was a narrow strip of leather containing a faded notation in formal palace hand, naming Neria as temporary custodian of the queen cloth during restoration. The writing was damaged, but legible enough to challenge the old lie. Amadi stared at it in disbelief. All these years, it had been hidden in work her mother never finished. Jabari's expression sharpened, though his voice remained calm. "This is not rumor," he said. "This is a door." The next morning, while drums announced the second day of the feast, Jabari left early and moved through the town as if he were merely another traveler drawn by celebration. Yet by noon, he had spoken to more people than most elders managed in a week. He shared kola nuts with the blind drummer, who remembered seeing the palace steward Duma visit Neria's workshop the night before the accusations spread. He spoke with an aging dye seller who recalled that bolts of imported cloth vanished from the storehouse that same season and reappeared later in the private warehouse of Kato's father, the trader Maro. He bought sweet cane for the kitchen girls and learned that Lady Siwa often took ceremonial items home before public events, claiming she was protecting them from careless servants. Piece by piece, a shape emerged. The theft had never been the act of a poor seamstress. It had been a quiet arrangement among powerful people who needed a defenseless woman to absorb blame. And while Jabari gathered truth, Amadi did what she had always done when the world wounded her. She worked. She delivered festival sashes. She hemmed dancing skirts. She repaired a torn veil for a bride who barely thanked her. Near evening, a messenger from the feast compound arrived in panic. The royal canopy cloth, meant to be raised above the elders during the closing ceremony, had ripped during the storm, and no tailor in the central market could fix the heavy ceremonial weave before dawn. Lady Siwa had apparently forgotten her contempt, now that she needed skilled hands. "Can you do it?" the messenger asked. Amadi looked at the shredded cloth when it was carried into her room and recognized instantly that it had once been mended by her mother. Along one edge was the same blue thread technique Neria used to anchor beadwork so tightly that it could survive 3 generations. Something in Amadi's chest tightened. Here was the craft they mocked, the inheritance they tried to bury, the evidence that her mother had served the palace with honor. She could have refused. She could have said the rich should repair their own dignity. Instead, she lit 2 lamps, boiled bitter tea to stay awake, and worked through the night while the town slept. Jabari returned after midnight and found her bent over the cloth, eyes burning from strain, hands moving with terrible concentration. He offered to help thread needles, and she let him. They worked mostly in silence, except for the moments when he asked soft questions, and she answered without self-pity. Why had she still agreed to repair the cloth after the insult? Because if she allowed other people's ugliness to decide her actions, then they would own more than her name. Why had she saved the boy at the feast? Because pain travels fast unless someone stops it. Why had she kept sewing in a town that treated her as small? Because talent is a kind of witness, and one day the truth would need proof that she had not collapsed under contempt. Just before dawn, the canopy was whole again, stronger than before, the tear hidden beneath a pattern of river spirals and rising birds that made the repair look intentional, even noble. Jabari looked at the finished cloth for a long time and said quietly, "There are palaces built with less grace than this." By afternoon, the whole town gathered for the final feast in the broad royal field beyond the market. Drums thundered. Hunters fired powder into the sky. Women ululated. Chiefs from surrounding villages arrived under umbrellas of crimson and gold. Amadi came only because the repaired canopy had to be delivered and installed, and even then she intended to stand at the back and leave unnoticed. But fate, when it has watched long enough, sometimes chooses a crowd. The ceremony began under the cloth she had restored. Elders praised the beauty of the work, without knowing whose hands had saved their embarrassment. Kato strutted among guests in embroidered agbada, laughing loudly, already half drunk on millet wine and inherited arrogance. Lady Siwa basked in compliments as if she herself had stitched the fabric. Then came the procession of honored visitors, and with it a stir so sudden that even the drummers faltered. 3 black horses entered the field, followed by royal guards in blue and silver. At their center rode a young man Amadi recognized before anyone announced him, though now he wore layered cloth, coral beads, and the authority he had hidden inside plain indigo. The dusty traveler stepped down, and the master of ceremonies dropped to one knee. Voices rippled through the field like wind over dry grass. "The Crown Prince! The heir from the river capital! Prince Jabari!" Some gasped. Some bowed too late. Kato's smile vanished. Lady Sewa's mouth opened, closed, then opened again with no sound inside it. Amadi stood still, her breath caught between disbelief and dawning understanding. Jabari, now Prince Jabari before all eyes, did not immediately take his place beneath the canopy. Instead, he walked slowly across the field until he stood where every person could see him. "People of Ikena," he began, his voice clear and carrying. "I came to your town without drums, without guards, and without titles, because my mother, the Queen Regent, taught me that a ruler who wishes to know the truth must sometimes arrive too small to be obeyed." Murmurs moved through the crowd. He continued, "I was sent to inspect tribute records, market levies, and old complaints buried beneath polite silence. What I found was not only theft of goods. I found theft of honor." He raised one hand, and 2 guards led forward the blind drummer, the dye seller, and a palace clerk from the capital, who carried ledgers bound in leather. Another guard brought out bolts of ceremonial cloth bearing the royal crest, recovered that morning from a sealed warehouse owned by Maro, the trader. Kato staggered backward. Maro himself, dragged from the elders' section pale with fear, tried to speak, but the prince silenced him with a glance. The clerk opened the ledger and read aloud entries proving storehouse cloth had been diverted years ago, the missing goods reassigned on paper to damaged inventory, while private transactions enriched Maro and the old steward Duma, who had died months earlier before judgment could reach him. Then Jabari held up the faded leather notation found in Amadi's trunk and said, "This mark confirms that Neria, daughter of Loma, was not a thief. She was entrusted with restoration work by palace order. Her name was buried so that better-dressed criminals could walk free." A collective sound rose from the crowd, not quite a cry, not quite a prayer. Some of the very people who had repeated the lie now lowered their heads, as if shame might hide them. Lady Siwa protested, accusing servants, confusion, old records, anything that might save her pride. But one of the kitchen girls stepped forward, trembling, and confessed that she had long ago seen Siwa remove ceremonial bundles from the storehouse under cover of darkness. Others spoke. Fear cracked. Silence lost its power. Truth, once given a witness, multiplied faster than rumor ever had. Prince Jabari ordered Maro's warehouse sealed, the trader's assets inventoried, and Lady Siwa removed from all ceremonial duties pending judgment in the capital. He declared before the elders that the name of Neria would be restored in the palace archive, and that reparations from the seized goods would fund a textile house for widows, apprentices, and fatherless girls. Yet still he had not said the one thing the crowd now sensed was forming in him. He turned then, not to the chiefs, not to the wealthy, but to Amadi, standing near the last row of benches in a plain blue wrapper no one would have noticed yesterday. "Come forward," he said. The field parted around her. She walked slowly, aware of every eye that had once looked through her and now looked too hard. When she stood before him, he did something that no one in Ikena would ever forget. The crown prince of the river house removed one beaded ring from his right hand, lowered himself onto one knee in the dust before a poor seamstress, and bowed his head. Women screamed. Men stumbled backward in shock. Even the drummers missed their beat. Jabari looked up at her and said, "Amadi, daughter of Neria, I first saw you when you were being mocked by people who mistook poverty for smallness. I saw you save a child who had never thanked you. I saw you feed a stranger while your own cupboard was almost empty. I saw you repair a cloth for those who insulted you because your character did not wait for fairness to become itself. A crown can command obedience, but it cannot sow wisdom into a heart. It cannot force kindness into a cruel person. It cannot buy the dignity you carried when you had nothing to gain from it. I was sent to uncover corruption, but I found more than corruption. I found the measure of a woman whose strength would humble palaces." The field had gone so still that the flutter of the canopy above them sounded loud. "Before all these witnesses," he said, "I ask not as a rescuer, not from pity, and not because today uncovered your worth, for your worth existed before any of us were wise enough to see it. I ask because a kingdom is safer beside truth than beside beauty without mercy, and stronger beside courage than beside wealth without conscience. Will you consider becoming my wife and walking with me where power too easily forgets the people beneath it?" Tears stood in Amadi's eyes, but they did not fall at once. For once in her life, all of Ikena was waiting on her voice. She could have answered immediately and given the crowd a simple ending. Instead, she did something wiser. She said, "My prince, if I speak today, let it not be because my life became precious only when royalty looked at it. Let everyone here understand that what you honor in me existed while they laughed." Jabari bowed his head deeper. "That is exactly what must be remembered," he said. Only then did Amadi place her burned, scar-marked hand in his and answer, "If I walk with you, I will walk as the daughter of Neria, as the keeper of my own mind, and as a woman who does not forget the market road." Jabari smiled, not with triumph, but with recognition. "Then that is the only way I would ask." The sound that followed shook the field. Drums exploding back to life, women ululating, children shouting, old men weeping into their beards because they had just seen the order of pride turned upside down in a single afternoon. Kato stood frozen, his face drained of the swagger that had once made others fear him. He tried to slip away, but Jabari stopped him with only a sentence. A man who laughs at a woman for being poor often does so because he knows wealth is the only thing speaking for him. The crowd erupted again, this time not with cruelty, but with the fierce relief of justice finally saying aloud what everyone had long suspected. In the weeks that followed, Ikena changed in ways that made gossip itself seem embarrassed. The palace sent record keepers, magistrates, and builders. Maro's hidden storehouses were emptied, and their contents sold to create the Neria House of Cloth, a large workshop where abandoned women, widows, and apprentices learned weaving, cutting, dyeing, and embroidery under Amadi's direction. The old blind drummer was given a permanent seat at public ceremonies. The kitchen girls who testified were offered wages instead of fear. The restored ceremonial canopy, with Amadi's river spirals and rising birds, was hung each year at the new yam feast as a reminder that what is torn can return stronger in honest hands. As for Amadi, she did marry Prince Jabari in time, but not the next morning, and not because a public proposal forced her into a story the town could celebrate. She visited the capital first. She met the Queen Regent, who embraced her not like a prize, but like an answer to a prayer she had nearly stopped speaking aloud. She studied court life with clear eyes. She demanded that Neria's name be read publicly before the palace council. She asked that girls from towns like Ikena be chosen for education by merit, not by lineage. And when she finally stood beside Jabari in marriage cloth of deep blue and gold, she wore around her wrist the measuring cord that had belonged to her mother, because some inheritances are worth more than jewels. Years later, people would still retell the story, but the wisest among them never said the prince rescued the seamstress. They said he recognized her. They said a whole town was forced to confront how easily it had bowed to rumor, mocked quiet excellence, and confused poverty with failure. Mothers told their daughters that skill can survive contempt. Fathers told their sons that a proud mouth often hides an empty spirit. And whenever strangers asked why the annual feast canopy bore birds rising from a repaired seam, elders would answer, "Because the strongest beauty in this land was stitched where people once thought there was only damage." So if you ever find yourself in a place where the loud are celebrated and the gentle are ignored, remember Amadi of Ikena, who was shamed at the feast, tested in private, faithful in obscurity, and honored not because she became worthy overnight.
Press the subscribe button for many new untold African folktales, only on Untold African.